classic. Before that, BBC Two tracks the recent changes at the top of the Labour Party in the wilderness years.
Early in the morning on the 7th of June 1987, Neil Kinnock hid his bitter disappointment at Labour's third successive election defeat and thanked his campaign team at party headquarters. The scale of the loss convinced him that his party had to undergo nothing short of a revolution.
Making change on the scale that we had to do it involved some risks. The risk that, as Margaret Thatcher put it, if they would abandon their most cherished policies in opposition, what will they do with their promises in government?
Keep fighting us.
No, we do that.
Keep fighting us.
All the way,
Keep fighting us.
I don't know any other way. Okay. But my view was that any risks attached to being accused of inconsistency and insincerity because of changing were much less than the awful price to be paid for not changing. And in any case, it was right to change.
I think the position taken by Labour's leaders in the late 80s and into the 90s was a position of surrender, or an acknowledgement that really we had lost the argument, that a Thatcherite hegemony had been established to which we could only accommodate. We couldn't change it fundamentally.
Kinnock was determined to take his party to the right, but for a man of the left, the move was bound to lead to his downfall.
His very drive, his what the gurus call the project for change, inevitably meant that he would actually be seen to have shifted over those crucial years the ground of the Labour Party. The mistrust, the uncertainty that created was in the end his downfall. But there was absolutely nothing that he could have done about that.
After 4 years as leader, Neil Kinnock had established himself as the absolute ruler of his party. He now ordered a far-reaching review to revamp Labour's policies. In his determination to drive the changes through, he crushed dissenters in the shadow cabinet with a ruthlessness reminiscent of his opponent, Margaret Thatcher.
I think you become convinced you're right. And when there are many people against you, it's like a captain on a ship. You have to make your decisions, and they're very lonely decisions. And Neil used to feel a lot of people ducked the decisions, and he had to make them, and he had great courage for it. But I felt sometimes he got caught up with being too courageous, and sometimes the political judgment was affected by that. And you were either with him or against him, and that applied to an awful lot of us, and that is if you were at all critical.
Right, sir.
I think Neil became absolutely obsessed, and understandably, perhaps rightly, with the notion of winning. He became a very powerful leader, which was very much at odds with the public image of him as a sort of bumbling incompetent who couldn't make up his mind about things.
1, 2, 3!
Smile.
He became very impatient and scornful of people who objected in any way to the course he'd mapped out, the course he saw as leading to victory. Of course, he was helped in his attitude by the support of many of those on the right who, in any case, wanted to abandon old commitments.
You walk with Douglas.
It was often said at Westminster that Margaret Thatcher had more influence on the left than any Labour politician. To Neil Kinnock, many of her policies seemed irreversible, and Labour had to adapt to them. Britain was more affluent, increasingly middle class. An influential group of colleagues agreed.
I mean, the Kinnock camp was a good camp to be in because it actually started addressing the voters' needs. So it isn't a question of signing up to something that's kind of, you know, sexy or clever or mainstream or on a roll. It's realpolitik. It's about, if you want political power, you cannot ignore where people are, and you can't say, oh, you know, the electorate are wrong because they all want their own house, or they all want to go on continental holidays, or they care more about going to movies. That's the real world.
The policy review began with a polling effort called Labour Listens. Its aim was to identify policies which matched the changing views of the British people.
Hello, Mr. Lynch. I'm calling from the local Labour Party. I'm a local councillor. We're starting our Labour Listens campaign, where we're just seeking the views of ordinary people. We wonder if you could take...
The left was suspicious. They saw polling as a self-serving means of abandoning socialism.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why your Labour Party is into trouble, when you have people like Ben.
If the newspapers said the Labour Party was divided, which they always did, they'd say, do you think the Labour Party is divided? And then if the newspapers were saying the left is a threat, they'd say, do you think the left is a threat?
Please tell me whether the statement applies to any of the main parties. That's Labour, Conservative, the Alliance, the SDP. It seems very disorganised. Labour, Tory...
Labour all the way through.
Doesn't seem to have any clear policies. Labour, Tory, Alliance, SDP.
But there was no serious attempt to use that tool of research, which is a valuable one, for the purpose of getting across what we wanted to say and believed in. It was simply a mirror of what the Conservative media were saying about us, with a view to getting us to become as like the Conservatives as we could, in the hope that we would then somehow win their support.
We couldn't win an election just with the votes of the poor and the deprived and the ethnic minorities. My constituency is a constituency which is predominantly composed of voters who are poor and deprived, with a considerable number of people from the ethnic minorities. And I kept increasing my majority at every general election, but it didn't do my constituents any good, because what they needed was a different government. And the only way we could get a different government was by adding to the votes of the poor and the deprived and the ethnic minorities the votes of affluent people living in the southeast of England and in other parts of England.
As the policy review progressed, Neil Kinnock became isolated at Westminster. He was the object of constant sniping from his own side in the House of Commons, much of which was leaked to the press. Although he was moving the party in their direction, the old right-wingers remained scornful of him. They still regarded him as a lightweight and no match for Margaret Thatcher in the House of Commons. As time passed, Neil Kinnock felt beleaguered and embittered.
I was uneasy and I was deeply concerned. And some days I was depressed, yes. I mean, you'd have to be a madman not to be. Because every newspaper I opened was full of critical references.
The party held a series of meetings for senior members to thrash out the policy review. But they were overshadowed by the continued dissatisfaction with the leader.
There was always a clique, so it's unfair to describe it as a clique, but there was a group around Roy Hattersley, John Smith, Jack Cunningham, Donald Dewar, who'd all been together for a long time. And I think there was an underlying belief in the right-wing group in the Shadow Cabinet that our position, our fortunes could be transformed if only Neil could be removed and replaced, I think, by John Smith. I think by this time it was clear that perhaps Roy Hattersley's time had gone, and I think Roy himself was clear that it would be John Smith.
I think that Brian's right. There were people doing that, of course, and it led to a lot of bad feeling, I think, between Neil and John in many ways. So Brian's right to say that.
John Smith, Kinnock's shadow chancellor, had served in the last Labour cabinet. His friends on the right admired his intellect and his command of the House of Commons, and they rated Smith's parliamentary skills above those of Neil Kinnock.
Even when he was doing marvels with the Labour Party in other ways, the House of Commons could be his Achilles heel. I say could be, because